The veil of crimson dust when the sun went out. Close your eyes and imagine a world before the glow of electricity, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the rising sun and the turning of the soil. It is April 1816. In the rolling hills of Vermont and the bustling ports of Boston, the American spirit is soaring. The War of 1812 is over, the era of good feelings has begun, and farmers are sharpening their plows for a season of gold. But thousands of miles away, in the Dutch East Indies, a mountain named Tambora had already screamed. It was the loudest sound ever heard by human ears, a tectonic roar that punched a hole into the stratosphere, vomiting 100 cubic kilometers of ash and sulfur into the sky. As the Americans slept, a ghostly, invisible veil began to drift across the oceans. It was a shroud of volcanic winter, destined to steal the sun, turn the rain into frozen needles, and change the course of American history forever. This is not just a story of a cold year. It is the story of how a frozen world gave birth to monsters, new religions, and the rugged endurance of the American soul. The morning of the indigo sun. In the spring of 1816, the citizens of the United States witnessed a sky they could not explain. In June, when the air should have been thick with the scent of blooming clover and humid heat, a strange, dry fog settled over the eastern seaboard. Witnesses in New York and Pennsylvania looked up to see the sun not as a golden orb, but as a pale, sickly violet disk. It was so dimmed by the high-altitude ash that a man could stare directly at it with the naked eye at noonday without blinking. There were no sunspots. There was only a haunting, bruised light that refused to warm the earth. On June 6th, the unthinkable happened. In Albany, New York, and across the mountains of Vermont, a massive blizzard began to howl. It wasn't a light dusting. It was a foot of heavy, killing snow in the middle of the harvest season. Birds fell dead from the trees, their feathers frozen stiff. Sheep that had just been sheared for the summer, huddling together in the corners of frozen pastures, shivering until they drew their last breaths. The farmers, men who had survived revolutions and wilderness, stood on their porches in woolen coats, looking at their blackened, frozen corn crops with a hollow terror in their chests. They called it 1800 and froze to death. The migration of the desperate. As the weeks passed and the frosts continued into July and August, a great hunger began to gnaw at the edges of the young nation. The price of oats and corn skyrocketed. In the pubs of Philadelphia, men spoke in hushed tones about the end of days. This ecological disaster triggered one of the most important movements in American history, the Great Migration to the West. Families who had farmed the rocky soil of New England for generations realized that the land had turned against them. They packed their lives into Conestoga wagons, their wheels creaking against the frozen ruts of muddy roads. Among these travelers was a young man named Joseph Smith. His family, devastated by 3 years of crop failure in Vermont, fled toward the softer climate of Palmyra, New York. Had the sun stayed warm in 1816, the Smith family might never have moved. The visions that led to the founding of Mormonism might never have happened in that specific burned-over district. The very fabric of American religion was being restitched by a volcano they didn't even know existed. The birth of monsters on Lake Geneva. While the American farmers struggled for bread, the year without a summer was casting a different kind of shadow over in Europe. On the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of young, rebellious writers were trapped inside the Villa Diodati by the relentless freezing rain and unnatural darkness that plagued the U.S. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and a 19-year-old Mary Shelley sat by a crackling fire, unable to step outside into the gloom. To pass the time, they challenged each other to write the most terrifying story imaginable. Inspired by the apocalyptic weather, the flickering lightning, and the pervasive sense of doom, Mary Shelley began to dream of a man stitched together from corpses brought to life by a spark. She wrote Frankenstein. In the same room, the modern vampire story was born. The darkness of 1816 didn't just kill the crops, it birthed the modern monsters of our nightmares. The veil of crimson dust had turned the world into a Gothic stage. Continuing our journey through the frost-bitten heart of 1816, the air grows thinner and the shadows longer. As the American settlers realized that the sun had truly abandoned them, a collective psychological shift began to take hold, a mixture of desperate innovation and profound spiritual terror. The Dark Sabbath of the Pioneers. By August of 1816, the psychological toll on the American frontier had reached a breaking point. In the small towns of New Hampshire and Maine, the Sabbath, usually a day of community and quiet reflection, turned into a scene of apocalyptic fervor. People crowded into unheated wooden churches, their breath blooming like white ghosts in the freezing pews. The preachers, sensing the end of the world, spoke of the vials of wrath being poured out upon the earth. The sun, still that eerie, bruised purple, hung low in the sky, providing no warmth to the parched, frozen soil. It was during these dark Sabbaths that the American identity began to harden. Neighbors who had once competed for land now shared their last bags of moldy seed corn. In Vermont, a story is told of a man named Abraham Miller who walked 40 miles through a July snowstorm just to find a bushel of grain for his starving children. He found it, but on the walk back, his fingers froze to the burlap sack. When he finally reached his cabin, he couldn't let go of the food. His wife had to pour warm water over his hands to peel the frozen cloth from his skin. This was the grit that built the West, a resilience forged not in the sun, but in the ice of an endless winter. The ghost of the harvest. In the mid-Atlantic states, specifically Pennsylvania and Maryland, the year without a summer created a surreal landscape. Imagine a cornfield in late August. Usually, the stalks would be 10 feet high, golden and swaying in a humid breeze. In 1816, the stalks were stunted, barely 3 feet tall, and coated in a black rust caused by the constant damp and freezing nights. Farmers attempted to save their crops by building massive bonfires around the perimeter of their fields, staying up all night to keep the frost from settling on the silk of the corn. From a distance, the American countryside looked like a battlefield at night. Thousands of flickering fires lighting up the horizon, men and women silhouetted moving like restless spirits against the orange glow. But the fires weren't enough. The corn died in the husk. The ghost of the harvest became a common phrase. Because grain was the primary fuel for horses, the engines of the 19th century, transportation began to collapse. Without grain, the horses grew weak. Without horses, the mail didn't move, and the goods from the ports couldn't reach the inland villages. The young United States was facing its first true existential threat, not from a foreign army, but from a silent atmospheric strangulation. The alchemy of hunger and the birth of the bicycle. While the Americans were migrating west to escape the frost, the hunger in Europe had reached a desperate peak. In Germany, the price of feeding a horse became so high that people were forced to slaughter their livestock just to survive. A young inventor named Karl von Drais watched the horses dying in the streets of Mannheim. He realized that humanity needed a way to move that didn't require a stomach full of grain. In the height of the 1816 volcanic winter, he retreated to his workshop and emerged with a strange contraption, a wooden frame with two wheels that the rider pushed with their feet. He called it the Lauf machine, or the running machine. It was the direct ancestor of the bicycle. The global cooling caused by Mount Tambora had literally forced human ingenuity to bypass biological limits. The bicycle wasn't born from a desire for exercise or leisure. It was born from the cold, hard fact that there was no food left for the horses. The exodus to the Ohio Valley. As the frost of September 1816 arrived, the Ohio fever hit New England like a wildfire. Thousands of families decided they could no longer gamble their lives on the unpredictable Atlantic weather. They turned their backs on the graves of their ancestors and pointed their wagons toward the old Northwest, the lands of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The trail was grueling. The mud was often knee-deep, frozen solid in the mornings, and a treacherous soup by noon. But as they crossed the Appalachian Mountains, something miraculous happened. The further west they went, the less severe the volcanic veil seemed to be. The Ohio Valley, protected by different atmospheric currents, offered a glimmer of hope. This mass exodus changed the political map of America forever. It shifted the center of gravity away from the elite coastal colonies and into the rugged, egalitarian heartland. The year without a summer effectively accelerated the American manifest destiny by decades. The freezing wind was the invisible hand pushing the pioneers into the wilderness, forcing them to build a new empire in the mud and the snow. The cold continued to grip the world like a skeletal hand, but as the calendar turned toward the end of 1816, the mystery deepened. While the northern states were fleeing toward Ohio, the American South was experiencing a phenomenon that defied everything they knew about the natural world: the blue winter of the Deep South. In the sweltering lowlands of South Carolina and the muddy banks of the Mississippi, the summer of 1816 was supposed to be a season of suffocating heat and relentless mosquitoes. Instead, the volcanic veil brought a chilling silence. In August, travelers in Georgia reported seeing blue frost on the cotton plants, a chemical reaction between the volcanic sulfur in the atmosphere and the morning dew. The cotton, the white gold of the South, turned brittle and gray. The enslaved laborers, already living in grueling conditions, found themselves shivering in thin linen clothes designed for 100-degree heat. The birds, confused by the dim purple sun, stopped singing at midday, thinking it was twilight. This blue winter created a sense of supernatural dread. In the slave quarters, whispers spread of an ancient reckoning, while in the plantation big houses, owners paced the floors, watching the price of cotton collapse as the plants withered in the unnatural chill. For the first time in American history, the entire geography of the nation, from the Maine woods to the Gulf of Mexico, was united by a single, terrifying cooling: the frozen pulse of the great rivers. By the time November 1816 arrived, the great arteries of American commerce, the Hudson, the Delaware, and the mighty Ohio, began to choke with ice far earlier than usual. This was the frozen pulse. In a world without trains, the rivers were the lifeblood of the country. When the Ohio River froze in early November, hundreds of flatboats carrying families to their new lives in the West became trapped in the ice. These ice camps became temporary cities on the frozen water. Strangers shared fires, huddling together over iron pots of hasty pudding, a desperate mix of ground corn and water. It was during these long, frozen nights on the river that the American oral tradition flourished. Tall tales were born here, stories of men who could outrun the north wind and women who could melt the ice with a single stare. These legends were a psychological shield against the reality that they were stuck in the middle of a frozen wilderness with dwindling supplies. The American can-do spirit was being tempered in the literal forge of an ice-locked river. The science of the sun-eater. Back in the cities of the East, the few scientists of the era, men who called themselves natural philosophers, were desperately trying to decode the sky. Without satellites or telegraphs, they had no way of knowing that a volcano named Tambora had erupted on the other side of the planet. Benjamin Franklin had once theorized that volcanic dust could cool the Earth, but his theories were largely forgotten. Instead, the newspapers of 1816 were filled with wilder theories. Some claimed that the increasing use of iron lightning rods was draining the heat from the atmosphere. Others blamed the appearance of unusually large sunspots, which they called sun-eaters, believing the sun was literally decaying and dying. This lack of information created a golden age of superstition. People began carrying weather charms and seeking out weather prophets. One man in Connecticut became famous for predicting a blizzard in July. When it actually happened, he was treated like a messiah. The year without a summer proved that when humanity is stripped of its warmth and food, even the most rational mind begins to look for magic in the shadows. The thaw of 1817 and the birth of a new era. As the bells rang in the new year of 1817, the atmospheric veil finally began to thin. The sulfurous dust that had circled the globe for 22 months started to settle, falling as microscopic grit into the oceans and the soil. The sun of 1817 rose with a renewed golden ferocity. The year without a summer was over, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. New England was half empty, its population having bled out into the West. The bicycle had been invented, Frankenstein was being prepared for print, and the United States had learned a hard lesson about its own fragility. The farmers who stayed behind in the East began to diversify. They realized that relying on a single crop, like corn, was a death sentence. They began to plant hardy vegetables, root crops like potatoes and turnips that could survive a frost. This shift in agriculture laid the groundwork for the modern American food system. The story of 1816 is a story of how a single mountain in Indonesia redrew the map of the United States. It is a reminder that we are all living at the mercy of a planet that can, at any moment, choose to turn out the lights. As the echoes of the year without a summer faded, the American spirit didn't just thaw, it ignited. But the transition from the frozen silence of 1816 to the roaring expansion of the 1820s was marked by a series of strange atmospheric anomalies that felt like the Earth was trying to find its balance again. The ghost of the Green Mountain. In the spring of 1817, as the snow finally retreated from the valleys of Vermont, the landscape revealed the true cost of the volcanic winter. The hillsides, once lush with maple and pine, were skeletal. The extreme cold had burst the bark of ancient trees, leaving them bleeding sap into the thawing mud. It was during this time that the ghost of the Green Mountain began to appear in the local newspapers. Settlers reported seeing a massive, shimmering figure in the mist of the early morning, a great white stag that seemed to lead starving families toward hidden caches of wild leeks and edible roots. Modern historians suggest these were hallucinations brought on by ergotism, a fungus that grows on damp, frozen rye. But for the pioneers, it was a divine sign. This shared trauma of near starvation created a survivalist folklore in New England. They didn't just survive the cold, they developed a deep, almost mystical connection to the land's hidden resources. They learned that when the corn dies, the forest provides. This was the birth of the Yankee ingenuity that would later drive the Industrial Revolution. The steam-propelled dream. While the farmers were reclaiming their fields, the year without a summer had left a permanent scar on the American economy. The collapse of the horse and wagon system during the ice lock of 1816 had proven that the young nation was too slow. It was too disconnected. Enter DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York. He stood on the banks of the Hudson River and looked west toward the Great Lakes. He realized that if America was to survive another volcanic winter, it needed a way to move food and people that didn't rely on animal feed or clear skies. He proposed the Erie Canal, a 363-mile ditch through the wilderness. Critics called it Clinton's folly, arguing that the ground was still too frozen and the task too great. But the memory of the starving children of 1816 was fresh. The laborers, many of them Irish immigrants fleeing their own crop failures in Europe, dug through frozen clay and ancient rock. The canal became a liquid highway. It didn't just transport wheat, it transported ideas. It allowed the bounty of the Ohio Valley to flow back to the hungry cities of the East. The year without a summer was the silent architect of the American infrastructure. The canal wasn't just built of stone and water, it was built of the fear of another frost. The mystery of the singing sands. As the pioneers pushed further into the newly opened territories of Indiana and Illinois in 1818, they encountered a phenomenon that stopped them in their tracks. In the dunes near Lake Michigan, the sand sang. When the wind blew over the parched post-volcanic landscape, or when a wagon wheel rolled over certain stretches of beach, the earth emitted a low, haunting hum, like 1,000 bees trapped in a jar. To the weary travelers, who were still jumpy from the end-of-days rhetoric of 1816, this was terrifying. They called it the voice of the Great Spirit. We now know it was caused by specific grain sizes and moisture levels in the sand, but at the time, it reinforced the idea that the American West was a land of living magic. This sense of wonder and terror drew more people toward the frontier. They wanted to see the singing sands, the bottomless lakes, and the glass mountains. The disaster of 1816 had turned a generation of cautious farmers into a generation of obsessed explorers. The final ember, the great fire of the soul. By 1819, the weather had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the social climate was forever changed. The era of good feelings was actually an era of intense searching. Because the traditional world had failed them, the sun had literally gone out. People began to look for new truths. This period saw the rise of the circuit riders, preachers on horseback who rode through the mud of the frontier, shouting that the old ways were dead. They held camp meetings in the woods, where thousands of people would gather under the stars. The air, finally warm again, was filled with the sound of hymns and sobbing. These were the Great Awakenings. The year without a summer had hollowed out the American soul, leaving a vacuum that was now being filled with a fiery, democratic form of spirituality. Every man was his own priest. Every family was its own nation. The cold had forced them together, but the thaw had set them free. The United States that emerged from the veil of crimson dust was louder, faster, more religious, and more determined to conquer the horizon than ever before. As the 1820s dawned, the literal ice had melted, but a new kind of fever began to grip the American pulse. The survival of the Great Frost had given the pioneers a sense of invincibility. If they could survive a year without a sun, they could survive anything. This era became known as the time of the Great Stretching, where the borders of the known world began to tear at the seams. The Trail of the Midnight Sun. In 1821, a group of frontiersmen, led by the enigmatic and weather-scarred Captain Jedediah Smith, pushed further northwest than any map dared to suggest. They were chasing a rumor. A whisper passed among the fur trappers of the Rockies that there was a place where the sun never truly set in midsummer, a midnight sun that mirrored the noonday darkness of 1816. They trekked through the Bitterroot Mountains, their pack mules struggling through passes that remained choked with old snow, ice that had survived since the volcanic winter 5 years prior. This wasn't just a journey for pelts, it was a psychological mission. The men of this era were obsessed with the extremes of nature. One night, high in the Tetons, the aurora borealis exploded across the sky in shades of neon violet and crimson. colors that reminded the veterans of the party of the bruised skies of the frost year. They knelt in the snow, convinced they were seeing the spirit of the mountain. This journey opened the South Pass, the literal doorway to the Oregon Territory. The midnight sun wasn't a physical place, but a state of mind, the belief that the American horizon was infinite, and that no mountain, no matter how high or cold, could stop the march of the wagon wheels. The mechanical monsters of the 1820s. Back in the burgeoning industrial hubs of Lowell, Massachusetts, and Paterson, New Jersey, the year without a summer had left a different legacy, a deep, shivering distrust of the weather. If the sky could turn on you, then human survival must be detached from the sky. This sparked an explosion of mechanical monsters, massive steam-hissing looms and iron presses that roared 24 hours a day. Before 1816, most manufacturing was done in small, water-powered mills that froze shut in the winter. After the Great Frost, the drive for steam power became an obsession. The factories became the new cathedrals. The rhythmic thump hiss of the pistons replaced the singing of birds. Young women from the dying farms of Vermont, the very farms that had been buried in June snow, flocked to these brick fortresses. They traded the unpredictable purple sun for the steady, flickering light of oil lamps. This was the birth of the American working class. They weren't just making textiles, they were weaving a shield against nature itself. They were building a world where the temperature inside a building stayed the same regardless of the apocalypse outside. The mystery of the stone giants. As the Erie Canal neared completion in 1824, laborers digging through the limestone of western New York made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the scientific world. Deep beneath the roots of ancient oaks, they unearthed the bones of stone giants, the massive fossilized remains of mastodons. In the 1820s, the concept of extinction was still a radical, terrifying idea. If these giants could vanish from the earth, could humanity? To the canal diggers, these bones were proof that the year without a summer was just a warning shot. They believed these creatures had perished in a previous great cold. The discovery sparked a craze for natural curiosities. Traveling shows began hauling massive tusks and rib cages from town to town. People paid their last nickels to stand in the shadow of a jawbone that could swallow a man. It reinforced the Gothic American identity, a sense that we are walking on the graves of titans and that the ground beneath our feet is filled with the ghosts of a world that was far more violent and colder than our own. The echo in the Atlantic. While the American heartland was being dug and built, the sea remained a place of lingering ghosts. Sailors returning to the ports of Salem and Nantucket reported ghostbergs, massive towering cathedrals of blue ice drifting far further south than ever before. These were the last remnants of the Arctic shelves that had been shattered and pushed south during the cooling of 1816. The North Atlantic became a graveyard of merchant ships. The Sea of Silence became a common term in maritime journals, describing pockets of fog so thick and cold that the sound of a ship's bell wouldn't carry more than 10 feet. It was during one of these ice fogs that a young sailor named Herman Melville supposedly heard the story of a great white whale, a creature as pale as the volcanic ash and as cold as the snow of 1816. The weather hadn't just changed the land, it had turned the ocean into a mirror of human obsession. The trauma of the frozen year was being distilled into the greatest literature the world would ever know. The world was no longer just a collection of colonies, it was a sprawling, steam-powered, bone-digging empire. But as the 1830s approached, a new mystery began to emerge from the swamps of the South. A whispering wind that brought with it the scent of a different kind of change. The 1830s arrived not with a whimper, but with a mechanical scream. The survivors of the frozen year were no longer children. They were the architects of a new, defiant civilization. They had seen the sun fail, and in response, they decided to build their own suns out of iron, coal, and fire. This was the era of the iron horse, a machine that promised to outrun the very seasons themselves. The race against the ghost of 1816. In 1830, a small experimental steam locomotive named the Tom Thumb sat on a track in Baltimore. It was a spindly, top-heavy contraption that looked more like a giant tea kettle than a revolution. But to the men standing on the platform, it represented something profound: independence from nature. A stagecoach proprietor, fearful of losing his business, challenged the locomotive to a race. He chose his finest gray mare, a horse that descended from the hardy stock that had survived the grain famine of 1816. It was a battle between the biological past and the mechanical future. As the race began, the horse leapt ahead, its muscles rippling in the humid Maryland air. The Tom Thumb hissed and sputtered, its gears grinding as it struggled to find its rhythm. For a moment, it seemed the old world would win. But then, the pressure in the boiler stabilized. The piston began to pump with a relentless, rhythmic fury. The locomotive drew level with the horse. The driver of the Tom Thumb, a man who remembered shivering in a Vermont cellar during the June blizzard of 1816, pushed the lever forward. The machine didn't tire. It didn't need oats. It didn't fear the frost. It surged ahead at the terrifying speed of 18 miles per hour. Although a belt later slipped and the horse technically won, the message was clear. The era of the animal was ending. The era of the atmospheric engine had begun. The whispering wind of the deep swamps. While the North was building railroads, the South was haunted by a different kind of mystery. In the bayous of Louisiana and the cypress swamps of Florida, a phenomenon known as the whispering wind began to be reported by scouts and runaway slaves alike. The air in the swamps would suddenly turn unnaturally cold, a pocket of 1816 air trapped as if by magic in the middle of a southern summer. When these cold pockets moved through the Spanish moss, they created a high-pitched whistling sound that sounded like human speech. The locals believed these were the voices of those who had perished during the blue winter of the frost year. These ghost winds became a central part of Southern Gothic folklore. They were said to precede great changes or disasters. In 1832, when the Great Cholera riot broke out, witnesses swore they heard the whispering wind howling through the streets of New Orleans just hours before the first patient fell ill. The trauma of the volcanic winter was no longer just a memory. It had become a spectral part of the American landscape, a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. The sky of fallen stars. On the night of November 12, 1833, the American public was reminded once again that they were not the masters of the heavens. For nearly 9 hours, the sky literally fell. It was the Great Leonid meteor shower. Thousands of streaks of fire poured across the firmament every minute. To a population still scarred by the indigo sun and the noonday darkness of 1816, this looked like the final judgment. In the cotton fields of Alabama, thousands fell to their knees in prayer. In the streets of Boston, people climbed onto their rooftops, convinced the atmosphere was catching fire. "The stars are falling like ripe figs from a tree," one newspaper editor wrote. But unlike 1816, this event brought a new kind of curiosity. Scientists at Yale University used the event to prove that meteors were not vapors from the Earth, but stones from space. This was the moment the American mind moved from superstition to astronomy. They realized that the year without a summer and the night of falling stars were part of a larger cosmic clockwork. The terror was being replaced by a hunger for data. The American was no longer a victim of the sky. He was its observer. The Leviathan of the rails. By 1835, the iron horse had grown from a toy to a Leviathan. The Baltimore and Oakland Railroad was carving paths through the Appalachian Mountains, the same mountains that the starving pioneers had struggled to cross on foot 20 years earlier. The construction was a feat of raw human will. Men used black powder to blast through solid granite, creating tunnels that felt like the throat of the earth. Inside these tunnels, the air was always cold, always damp, a permanent reminder of the 1816 winter. The railroad did something the Erie Canal could not. It moved at a speed that collapsed time. A journey that once took 3 weeks of agonizing travel through mud and snow now took 3 days. The year without a summer had taught America that isolation was death. The railroad was the cure. It was the iron stitch that sewed the fractured states together into a single, breathing organism. The pioneers were no longer just survivors, they were commuters. The rugged endurance of the Vermont farmer was being traded for the precision of the station master's pocket watch. The world was becoming smaller, louder, and much, much faster. The 1830s were closing, and the great stretching was nearly complete. But as the nation looked towards the Pacific, a new shadow was forming, not from a volcano, but from the hearts of men. As the 1830s drew to a close, the American landscape was no longer just a map of soil and trees. It had become a network of copper and steam. The survivors of the Great Frost had learned that information was just as vital as food. If they had known a volcano was erupting in 1815, they might have prepared. Now, they were determined to ensure that no corner of the continent would ever be blind again. The nerve system of the Republic, the iron telegraph. In 1844, a man named Samuel Morse sat in the chambers of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and tapped out a message that would travel instantly to Baltimore. What hath God wrought? To the people of the mid-19th century, this was more than a clever invention. It was the ultimate victory over the silent winter. During 1816, news of the crop failures in the West took weeks to reach the starving cities of the East. Families died simply because they didn't know help was 10 miles away. The telegraph changed the physics of human existence. It was as if the nation had suddenly grown a nervous system. For the first time, the whispering wind of the South and the frozen pulse of the North were connected by a heartbeat of electricity. Farmers in Ohio could check the price of grain in New York before the sun had even fully risen. The atmospheric veil could no longer hide the truth. Man had captured lightning and forced it to carry his voice across the wilderness. The ghostly ascent. The Donner Party and the Sierra Shadow. While the East was buzzing with electricity, the West remained a place of brutal primeval power. In 1846, a group of families, the now infamous Donner Party, set out for California. They were the spiritual descendants of the 1816 pioneers, driven by the same westward fever. But they made a fatal mistake. They relied on a shortcut that hadn't been fully explored. As they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, a freak weather pattern, eerily reminiscent of the volcanic winter, trapped them in a high-altitude prison of snow. The storms weren't just snowfalls, they were atmospheric rivers that dumped 5 feet of powder in a single night. The oxen froze where they stood, their humps protruding from the drifts like gray boulders. As the months passed and the food ran out, the refined veneer of the 19th century American collapsed. The story of the Donner Party became a dark mirror to the resilience of 1816. While the earlier generation had shared their last crumbs, the desperation in the Sierras led to a darkness that the American psyche still struggles to reconcile. It was a reminder that even in the age of the telegraph, nature still held the ultimate kill switch. The California hearth, gold in the frozen veins. In 1848, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill turned the Great Migration into a tidal wave. But the men who rushed to the hills were a different breed than the farmers of 1816. They weren't looking for a place to plant corn, they were looking for a way to escape the labor of the soil forever. The gold rush was a frenzy fueled by the new speed of information. The telegraph carried the news like a spark through dry brush. Within months, ships were rotting in San Francisco harbor because their crews had abandoned them for the mountains. These 49ers used high-pressure water cannons, or hydraulic mining, to literally wash away entire hillsides. They were treating the earth not as a mother to be tended, but as a vault to be cracked open. The reverence for the land that had been born during the year without a summer was being replaced by a brutal industrialism. They were no longer waiting for the sun to provide, they were tearing the riches out of the dark, cold veins of the earth. The Great Unraveling, a nation divided by the harvest. By 1850, the United States was a giant with a fractured soul. The iron horse and the copper wire had connected the states physically, but the cultural gap was widening. The North had used the memory of the 1816 famine to build an industrial fortress, factories, schools, and a diverse economy. The South had doubled down on the blue winter logic, believing that their survival depended entirely on the mastery of the land through the labor of the enslaved. Very weather that had once united the country in shared suffering was now pulling them apart. The North no longer needed the South's weather-dependent crops as much as they used to. They had their own machines and their own trade routes to Europe. The year without a summer had been a tragedy they survived together, but the prosperity that followed was a prize they were no longer willing to share. The clouds were gathering again, not of volcanic ash this time, but of gunpowder and political thunder. The era of the pioneer was ending, and the era of the soldier was about to begin. We have traveled from the frozen fields of Vermont to the gold-streaked mountains of California. The American spirit has been forged in ice and tempered in steam. As the 1850s bled into the 1860s, the atmospheric mystery of the past was replaced by a man-made storm. The children of the 1816 frost were now the gray-bearded leaders of a crumbling union. They had conquered the frozen soil, the Great Plains, and the Sierra Nevada, but they had not yet conquered themselves. The iron pulse of the Civil War. When the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in 1861, the year without a summer felt like a fairy tale from a distant world, yet the ghost of 1816 lived on in the technology of the war. This was the first industrial conflict in human history where the outcome was determined not just by bravery, but by the machines born from the Great Frost. The North, which had spent 40 years building the mechanical monsters to escape the whims of nature, now possessed a terrifying advantage. They had a sprawling web of railroads that could move armies in days, the same iron tracks that had replaced the frozen rivers of the pioneers. In the telegraph offices, President Abraham Lincoln sat hunched over the humming copper wires, receiving near-instant updates from the front lines. The nerve system of the Republic was now being used to coordinate the movements of hundreds of thousands of men. The quiet, isolated world of the early century was gone. The war was a high-speed electrical nightmare. The whispering wind as a map to freedom. While the armies clashed on the battlefields of Virginia, a silent, more heroic movement was taking place in the shadows. The Underground Railroad reached its peak during this era, and its conductors used the legends of the old pioneers to guide their way. Harriet Tubman and others like her knew the land in a way the generals never could. They used the whispering wind of the southern swamps, the same cold pockets of air that had terrified settlers decades earlier, as a natural navigation system. They knew that certain mosses grew thicker on the north side of trees during unnatural cold snaps, and they followed the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper, across a sky that was finally clear of volcanic ash. The trauma of the 1816 famine had taught the American people that the land had secrets. For those escaping slavery, those secrets were the difference between life and death. They weren't just running toward a border, they were running through a landscape that had been spiritually mapped by 40 years of struggle and survival. The sundogs of the Battle of Stones River. In late December 1862, during the brutal Battle of Stones River in Tennessee, soldiers on both sides witnessed a rare atmospheric phenomenon that brought back memories of the indigo sun. As the temperature plummeted toward zero, sundogs, shimmering spectral halos of light, appeared around the sun. To the exhausted, freezing soldiers, it looked like a celestial omen. Many of the older veterans, men who had heard their parents describe the year without a summer, whispered that the earth was turning cold again. The frost was so severe that men wounded in the no-man's land between the lines froze to death before the medics could reach them. The blood on the ground didn't soak into the soil, it turned into crimson ice. In that moment, the political ideologies of North and South vanished, replaced by the primal 1816 struggle for heat. For one night, the war stopped not because of a truce, but because the air itself had become a weapon. The transcontinental spike, sinnowing the continent. As the war ended in 1865, the nation was broken but desperate for a grand project to heal its soul. They looked back to the dream of the pioneers who had crossed the mountains in 1816. They decided to do the impossible, build a railroad that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the golden spike was driven into the ground. This was the final funeral for the year without a summer. The journey that had taken the Donner Party months of agony and which had cost the 1816 pioneers their lives could now be completed in 6 days in a velvet-lined carriage. The American was no longer a pioneer at the mercy of the wind, he was a passenger. The vast, terrifying wilderness that had frozen the corn in June 1816 had been tamed by a ribbon of steel. The great stretching was over. The United States was no longer a collection of territories. It was a singular industrial empire, forged in the coldest winter and tempered in the hottest war. The legacy of the crimson dust. Today, if you dig deep into the ice of the Arctic or the peat bogs of Vermont, you can still find a thin layer of gray ash, the remains of Mount Tambora's 1815 eruption. It is a silent witness to the year the sun went out. We are the descendants of the people who stayed. We are the children of those who didn't give up when the snow fell in July. The year without a summer didn't destroy America, it forced it to grow up. It pushed us west, it sparked our inventions, and it gave us the grit to face a future that is always, like the weather, unpredictable. As you drift off to sleep, remember that the stars above are the same ones the pioneers watched through the volcanic haze. The world is a fragile place, but the human spirit, especially the American spirit, is a fire that no amount of snow can truly extinguish. As the golden spike was driven home and the smoke of the Civil War cleared, the United States entered a period of surreal, glittering transformation known as the Gilded Age. But the survivors of the year without a summer knew that under the gold leaf there was always iron. And under the iron, there was always the unpredictable whim of the earth. The gilded shroud and the great fire of 1871. By the early 1870s, the memory of the 1816 frost had been replaced by a new obsession: heat. America was burning coal at a rate the world had never seen. The cities were growing taller, built of wood and ambition. But in October 1871, the atmosphere seemed to recall its old violent habits. A freak weather pattern, a superheated atmospheric drought, descended over the Midwest. On the same night, October 8th, the world began to burn. It wasn't just the Great Chicago Fire, it was a regional apocalypse. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm erupted, a phenomenon where the air itself becomes so hot that it creates a self-sustaining tornado of flame. Witnesses described the sky turning the same bruised violet that their grandfathers had seen in 1816. The fire of the soul that had driven the pioneers west was now consuming the very cities they had built. Thousands fled into the cold waters of Lake Michigan, shivering in the waves while the world above them turned into a furnace. It was a terrifying reminder: the earth that can freeze you in June can also incinerate you in October. The Wizard of Menlo Park, capturing the sun. As the ruins of Chicago were still cooling, a young man named Thomas Edison was working in a small lab in New Jersey. He was a child of the telegraph era, a man who understood that if nature could take away the sun, man must build his own. In 1879, Edison finally perfected the incandescent light bulb. This was the final victory over the noonday darkness. For the first time in human history, the setting of the sun, or its obscuration by volcanic ash, no longer meant the end of the day. The Edison sun didn't flicker like a candle or smell like whale oil. It was steady, clean, and defiant. The factories that had been born from the 1816 survivalist drive could now run 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The American rhythm was no longer dictated by the rotation of the planet, but by the flick of a copper switch. We had finally stepped out from under the shadow of the clouds. The ghost dance and the wounded earth. While the cities glowed with Edison's light, the frontier was witnessing a tragic spiritual echo of the 1816 end of days. On the Great Plains, the indigenous tribes who had survived the volcanic winter and the migration of the pioneers were facing their own existential frost. A prophet named Wovoka had a vision during a solar eclipse. He taught the ghost dance, a ritual that promised to bring back the buffalo, remove the white settlers, and restore the world to its pre-1816 purity. It was a movement born of extreme desperation, much like the Great Awakenings of the pioneers 40 years earlier. But the nerve system of the telegraph and the iron horse of the railroad moved too fast for prophecy. The U.S. Army, fearing an uprising, moved in. The tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890 marked the symbolic end of the American frontier. The land that had once been a vast, mysterious wilderness of singing sands and midnight suns was now fenced, mapped, and electrified. The dawn of the 20th century, the mechanical Eden. As the bells rang in the year 1900, the United States stood as the most powerful industrial force on Earth. The year without a summer was now a footnote in dusty history books, a story grandmothers told to children who didn't believe that snow could ever fall in July. America had become a mechanical Eden. We had automobiles replacing the horses that had starved in 1816. We had skyscrapers that pierced the clouds. We had even begun to dream of flight, of rising above the volcanic veil entirely. But the legacy of 1816 remained in the American DNA. It manifested as a restless energy, a prepper instinct, and a deep-seated belief that we must always be building, always moving, and always innovating. We became a nation of engineers because we were once a nation of starving farmers looking at a purple sun. Epilogue: The Whisper in the Ice. Tonight, as you sleep in a room warmed by the legacy of Edison and protected by the walls of an industrial empire, remember the veil of crimson dust. The story of 1816 frost is not just a story of cold weather. It is the story of how a disaster thousands of miles away can shatter a world and force a new one to be born. It is the story of how humanity, when pushed to the edge of extinction, doesn't just survive, it evolves. The next time you see a violet sunset or feel a sudden, unseasonable chill in the air, listen closely. You might just hear the whispering wind of the old pioneers reminding you that the earth is alive, the sun is a gift, and the fire of the human spirit is the only light that never truly goes out. As the 20th century roared into life, the memory of the frozen year transitioned from living history into a foundational myth. The American psyche had been permanently altered. We had become a nation that no longer waited for nature to provide. We dictated terms to the planet. However, as we moved into the age of the stratosphere, we discovered that the veil of crimson dust had one final secret to reveal. The sky-high pioneers, chasing the ash. In the early 1920s, a new breed of adventurer emerged, the high-altitude aviator. Pilots like Wiley Post began to push their primitive biplanes into the thin, freezing air of the upper atmosphere, the very place where the sulfurous clouds of Mount Tambora had sat a century earlier. They discovered a world of permanent winter. At 30,000 feet, the air was as cold as the Vermont blizzard of June 1816, regardless of the season below. Post, wearing a pressurized suit that looked like a deep-sea diver's outfit, discovered the jet stream, a river of wind that moved with such ferocity it could carry a plane across the continent in record time. This discovery allowed us to understand why the 1816 disaster had been so widespread. The volcanic ash hadn't just sat there. It had hitched a ride on these invisible atmospheric rivers, circling the globe and chilling the earth with surgical precision. We were no longer just surviving the weather. We were mapping its engine room. The Dust Bowl, the inverse echo. By the 1930s, the wheel of fortune turned again. If 1816 was the year without a summer, the 1930s became the decade without rain. The Dust Bowl was the inverse of the volcanic winter. Instead of freezing moisture, the American heartland faced a desiccated, suffocating heat. The black blizzards of Oklahoma and Kansas looked eerily similar to the descriptions of the 1816 indigo sun. Great walls of topsoil rose into the sky, blotting out the sun at noon. Once again, a mass migration began. The Okies followed the same trails their great-grandparents had blazed in 1816, heading west toward the promise of California. This era proved that the American spirit of grit was not a one-time fluke. The resilience forged in the ice of the 19th century was the same resilience that survived the dust of the 20th. We learned that the great stretching of the nation was a permanent process. We are a people perpetually in motion, fleeing the extremes of a temperamental continent. The atomic sun, a new kind of cloud. In 1945, in the high deserts of New Mexico, humanity created a volcano of its own. The Trinity test produced a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a mushroom cloud that punched into the stratosphere, much like the plume of Tambora. Scientists, reflecting on the cooling effects of 1816, began to theorize about nuclear winter. They realized that the same mechanisms that had frozen the corn in New England could be triggered by human hands. The year without a summer was no longer just a ghost story. It became a scientific warning. It showed us that the atmosphere is a fragile shield, and that if we filled it with enough dust, whether from a mountain or a bomb, the sun would once again turn violet and the world would fall silent. The Great Modern Thaw. Today, we live in the long thaw. The industrial engine that we built to protect ourselves from the cold of 1816 has worked perhaps too well. The carbon we've pumped into the air since the birth of the mechanical monsters is now warming the planet at a rate that would shock a 19th century farmer. But the legacy of 1816 remains our greatest tool. The year without a summer taught us adaptability. It taught us to diversify our food, to build networks of information, and to value the community over the individual during a crisis. When we look at the satellite images of our planet today, we see the swirling currents of the atmosphere that once carried the crimson dust. We are no longer victims of these currents. We are their stewards. The final midnight. The story of the veil of crimson dust ends here, in the modern world. It is a story that began with a roar in Indonesia and ended with a light switch in an American bedroom. As you finally drift into a deep, peaceful sleep, think of the 1816 farmer. He stood in a frozen field, his hands cracked from the cold, looking at a pale, purple sun. He didn't know why it was happening. He didn't know if it would ever end. But he didn't give up. He planted another seed. He moved his family. He built a wagon. You are the result of his refusal to surrender to the ice. The warmth you feel tonight was earned 200 years ago in the darkest, coldest summer the world has ever known. While the literal story of the year without a summer has reached its natural conclusion, the ripples of that era did not stop at the dawn of the modern age. In the final stretch of this historical journey, we look at the invisible thread, how the 1816 disaster paved the way for the world you see through your window today. The satellite eye, guarding the sun. In the 1960s, as the space race took the American imagination to the moon, the first weather satellites began to look back down at Earth. For the first time, humanity could see the global breath, the way air moves across continents. Scientists began to use these satellites to scan the ash layers of old eruptions. They looked back at the 1815 explosion of Tambora and used computer models to simulate the volcanic veil. They realized that if another Tambora happened today, our globalized food system would be under immediate threat. Because of the trauma of 1816, we built the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Tucked deep inside a mountain in the Arctic Circle, this doomsday vault holds millions of seeds from every corner of the Earth. It is a direct insurance policy against another year without a summer. We have finally moved from surviving the disaster to preventing its consequences before they even begin. The genetic memory of resilience. There's a theory in science called epigenetics, which suggests that extreme stress, like a famine or a great frost, can leave a mark on the DNA of a generation that is passed down to their children. When you look at the American hustle culture, the obsession with innovation and the prepper mentality that surfaces in times of crisis, you are seeing the genetic echoes of 1816. The pioneers who survived that year were the ones who were the most flexible, the most stubborn, and the most communal. They passed those traits down through the 1830s, the Civil War, and the Industrial Revolution. When you face a challenge today and find an unexpected reservoir of strength, you are tapping into a well that was dug by a farmer shivering in a Vermont field 2 centuries ago. You are the warmth that they fought so hard to protect. The modern ghost of Tambora. Every now and then, the world gets a small reminder of its fragility. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted. It was nowhere near the size of Tambora, but it was enough to lower global temperatures by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for a year. For a few months, the sunsets in the United States turned a familiar, bruised purple. The scientific community watched with bated breath, using sensors and satellites to track the sulfur. We were no longer terrified, we were curious. The mystery of the Sun Eater had been solved. We knew exactly what was happening. We had replaced the whispering wind of superstition with the data of the digital age. Final reflections. The silence of the snow. Imagine a cold winter night in the present. You are tucked under a heavy blanket, the heater is humming quietly, and the glow of your phone or laptop provides a steady, artificial sun. Outside, a light snow begins to fall. In 1816, that snow would have been a death sentence for your family's livelihood. Today, it is a decoration, a peaceful backdrop for a night of rest. The year without a summer was the fire that forged the modern world. It forced us to build the telegraph, the railroad, the light bulb, and the satellite. It forced us to move west and to look up at the stars with a critical, questioning eye. It was the greatest tragedy of the 19th century, but it was also the greatest catalyst for human progress. As the modern world sleeps, we look toward the final horizon of this saga. The story of 1816 is not just buried in the ice of the past, it is a living blueprint for our future. We have transitioned from a species that feared the sky to one that seeks to understand its most violent secrets. The Great Ice Core, a library of time. In the silent, white expanses of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists today drill deep into the crust of the Earth, pulling up cylinders of ice that act as a library of time. These ice cores contain trapped bubbles of air from the year 1816. When a researcher exhales in a lab today, they are standing next to the literal breath of the volcanic winter. By analyzing the chemical composition of this frozen time, we have discovered that the sulfur from Mount Tambora didn't just block the sun, it altered the very chemistry of the rain. This data is the foundation of modern climate science. The tragedy of the starving pioneer has become the data point for the modern environmentalist. We are using the suffering of the past to prevent the catastrophes of the future. The 1816 frost was the patient zero of global climate awareness. The digital harvest, overcoming the famine. If the year without a summer happened tomorrow, the world would react with the speed of light. We now have the Global Food Security Index, a digital map that tracks the harvest of every nation in real time. In 1816, it took months for a governor to realize his people were starving. Today, a satellite can detect a failing corn crop in Iowa or a locust swarm in East Africa before a single human eye sees it on the ground. We have replaced the ghost of the harvest with the algorithm of abundance. We use artificial intelligence to predict weather patterns years in advance, ensuring that the dark Sabbaths of the pioneers remain a memory, not a reality. The new pioneers, toward the Martian winter. As we look beyond the Earth, the lessons of 1816 are traveling with us. Scientists planning the first colonies on Mars are obsessed with the year without a summer. Why? Because Mars is a planet in a perpetual volcanic winter. It is cold, dusty, and has a thin atmosphere that barely holds the sun's warmth. The greenhouses we are designing for the red planet are modern versions of the bonfire-lit fields of 1816. We are learning how to grow food in 100% controlled environments, using LED lights to mimic the sun that the pioneers lost. The mechanical Eden we built to survive the frost is now the prototype for our survival among the stars. The American spirit of grit is no longer just a terrestrial trait, it is a cosmic requirement. The final light, a legacy of warmth. Imagine, for a moment, that you could travel back to June 1816. You find a young family huddled in a cabin in the woods of Maine. They are burning their furniture to stay warm. The father is looking at a handful of frozen seeds, his face etched with a despair we can barely imagine. If you told him that his struggle would lead to a world of instant communication, of light at the flick of a switch, and of ships that sail to the stars, he might not believe you, but he would feel a flicker of hope. He would know that his cold, dark night was the dawn of a brilliant, golden age. The veil of crimson dust has finally lifted. The sun is no longer a pale purple disk, but a roaring furnace of life. The whispering wind is now the hum of the internet, carrying the stories of our ancestors to every corner of the globe. You are the final chapter of this story. You are the warmth that survived the frost. Join our journey as we uncover the most thrilling and hidden chapters of history. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe to stay connected for more.